what is the neuronal circuit that governs for that kind of specific task. So we really don't know anything about it. Okay, so anyway, so we'll see over the time what we can try to explain. Let's see, first try to be familiar. This is a very simple thing, so I'm just trying to tell you, just be familiar about the different parts of our brain that are involved in different kind of function. So if you look at the frontal part, the extreme frontal part, you can see this some part is responsible for smell, and also this is the part often called its prefrontal cortex. That's actually is very much involved in a lot of your executive function, a lot of tough decision that someone takes that comes from this prefrontal area. And then if you look at the back side of your brain, it does one of the most important functions, that's the vision. You look at the occipital cortex, occipital lobe, that's one of the part that are responsible for your vision. And so you can see different parts of your brain. If you look at the temporal lobe, somewhere here, that actually is very much involved in your intellectual and emotional function. The place sometimes called hippocampus, that's the place where most of the memory actually is stored, is actually in this temporal lobe, and so on. Okay, but this is from the outside, you can just think in different parts of your brain and what are the areas are involved in what are the different kind of function. But if you want to see the inner side, internal structure of the brain, how can you do that? So I'm just trying to show you some of the way people try to understand, or if you want to see the inner part of your brain, how can you do? So the three standard way people does it. So you have to cut the brain in different ways. So one of the way you can cut is here mentioned here is the coronal sectioning. So in this process, you cut your brain from the front side to back side or back side to front side like this. So cut a thin sections and see what is there inside. So if you just look at the mid coronal section, somewhere in the middle part of your brain, you see there are two hemispheres, left and right, and in between there is place called, what do you call this is a cerebrospinal fluid pass through it. It's a ventricle, you see here. Now, if you can cut your brain from left side to right side or right side to left side, that kind of sectioning is called sagittal sections. And if you do that, if you just see the mid sagittal part, you can see some of the internal areas. See the name, some of the names, complicated name, but at least you see one of the name here is called amygdala. This is the one of the areas. Is the what do you call it? This part, temporal area. So this is the place where this is the area where actually it is responsible for your emotion, yes, emotional function, and the back of it is actually this line in the hippocampus that stores your various kinds of memory, and so on. So if you cut sagittal way, you can look at the different parts of the brain, internal parts of the brain. And similarly, you can cut your brain from top to bottom or bottom to top, and that kind of sectioning is called horizontal or axial sectioning. So three different ways you can cut your brain and look at various internal part of your brain. I think that's very, very clear when someone see that magnetic resonance imaging picture of a brain. I don't know whether any of you ever have chance to enter inside a MRI machine, because if you have some kind of brain problem, a headache or some serious problem, sometimes doctor might prescribe you for an MRI scan. And if by chance you enter an MRI scan, sometimes it takes 1 hour, 2 or 3 hours of time to scan one, get a brain scan. And in that case, in an MRI brain scan, they actually use all three processes. So if you look at the extreme right side, here this one, this is actually a coronal MRI scan. The middle one is a sagittal MRI scan, and this one is actually a axial or horizontal MRI scan. And then by doing all three different kind of scan, you can pinpoint any kind of problem that could be there in your brain. If there's a tumor present, cancer cells are present in the brain, you can easily point it out. Yes, that is there, and exactly where it is, you can point it out. Okay, so that's how three different way MRI machine can take a picture of your brain, and by looking at that, you can pinpoint where is your problems of the brain. Okay, so that's how we can look at various internal parts of your brain. Now let's see what are the cells that are present in a brain. So we are will be gradually going from cell to systems parts of our brain. So first look at the cells that present in our brain, and we all know the cell is called the neuron. But probably what do you think that you probably are not familiar about how the neuron actually discovered, the history behind it. So I'll just give you a little sense about it, little taste about. See, there are two guys. One is called Camillo Golgi. So he's an Italian scientist who actually, we all know the Golgi apparatus that's present in the cell, eukaryotic cell. That's the guy actually discovered. But he also discovered a dye that's called Golgi staining dye, Golgi stain. And when he put a small piece of brain inside the dye, after maybe 1 week or after 1 month, if you cut a very thin sections of the brain and look under a microscope, then you will be able to see, whatever he observed is some of the cells in the brain have extensive branching. You can see the pictures that is showing here. So you can see it's actually quite long. I mean, 150 years ago probably he have noticed. Okay, so those days there is no hi-fi microscope. He actually made his own handmade microscope. You can see there is some postal stamps that's shown here. And by making his own microscope, he observed those cells. Okay, and he find out the cells in our brain has extensive branching. That's one of the extraordinary findings that he made. But that's not enough. He also made a conclusion. That's the observation he made. But from the observation, he made a conclusion. He drew a conclusion, that is the two neurons. That time neuron was not actually named. So you can think about two cells in the brain that connected with each other like a spider web. So it's a continuous process. So information from one neuron can go to the other neuron directly. There's a continuous process. That was his conclusion. But at the same time, there's another scientist, the Spanish scientist, Santiago Ramon Cajal. He was using the brain, but he came with a completely different conclusion, like what Camillo Golgi said. So Camillo Golgi said the two neurons are connected with each other by a continuous process. They are directly connected each other. But the Ramon Cajal was saying that time that no, that's not correct. Two neurons are obviously connected with each other, but in between there is a close gap, very, very close space up there. Okay, so that's the controversy between these two guys. Although both of them got Nobel Prize, you see that Nobel Prize, both of them got Nobel Prize in 1906, by revealing the inner beauty of the nervous system. So you can see how beautiful it is. But here to point it out, the Ramon Cajal, of course you all know that Ramon Cajal was the right. There was a gap, and that gap is called synapse. So we'll be talking subsequent slide. But I am showing here one of the pictures that you can see here. That is his own hand drawing. And that he actually draw his own hand by observing just in an ordinary microscope that he himself made. So if you look at this picture, you can understand how beautiful picture are these, and you can think about how good he was in drawing. And from there he come to this conclusion. But of course whatever both of them are their hypothesis, that time it was not proved. So it takes quite a long time to prove finally there is a synapse. But obviously Cajal was right. Okay? I hope you understand that story behind it. So now you just think about the structure of the neuron. I am sure all of you have studied this. So there are cell bodies, the tip of it, there is dendrites which receives the information, and there's a long axon, and that on the cover on the axons there's a thick myelin sheath cover. That's the insulating cover, but in between there's a gap, that's called node of Ranvier. And then these axons actually form connections with the dendrite of the another neuron. Okay, so that's what the point junction is called the synapse, and there is a closed gap. That's what the Cajal said, and that's the right thing. So that's how the information from one neuron goes directly. But the problem comes when there is a synapse. So there's a closed gap, and what happens in this closed gap? So how the information from one neuron can then pass to the other neuron in that gap? We'll be talking about that. But if you use this Golgi stain, whatever we are showing here is a very low magnification image. But if you use very high magnification image, say 40x objective of a microscope, along with say mineral oil, so you know we have talked about this. So if you use that high power microscope, you can see pictures here. Some of the part, if you see, there are small extended structures. Okay, and these extended structures are called dendritic spines. I mentioned here dendritic spines. Of course, that was not discovered that time. This was with very high resolution microscope only you can see that. But to mention about this, same dye can be used to visualize that. So you can understand the power of Golgi staining that was discovered by one guy, say 1800 sometimes, 150 years ago. You can understand that. So the point here is, so by looking at high power microscope, high resolving power microscope, you will be able to see a lot of protruded, extended structures, and that is called the dendritic spine. And just I mentioned here, so these are the structures where a synapse can be formed. Now you can think about, if our brain has 100 billions of neurons, then you can think about how many such dendritic spine can we having in our brain. If just giving a small estimation, a single neuron might be having maximum maybe about 2 lakhs of these dendritic spines. Then you can calculate 100 billion neurons can have how many such dendritic spines. As I mentioned you, these dendritic spines, where actually you will be able to see the formation of synapse. So now you just come think about it. So these are the structures, these are the internal, this thin, small structure. These are the structure are actually not static. So the dendritic spines, the structure are very dynamic. They are constantly forming and they're constantly eliminating. And that is the reason, that's why I mentioned you, the hardware structure is constantly changing in our brain. And now I hope you got the clues, the understanding. These are the structures. So you, in other sense, you can think about the synapse are constantly changing in our brain, or you can say even dendritic spine structure are not static, not fixed number. They're continuously changing. At this moment, as you are listening my talk, listening to this class, so there could be huge changes are going on that in your brain. There could be a lot of new dendritic spines or synapses are now formed. Okay, at the end of the talk, some of them might be stable, or by maybe maximum you will lose at the end of the talk. Okay, so which means that you probably lose most of the memory related to this talk. Now you think about if they are constantly changing, and that is one of the most fundamental basis that you can tell that your brain is plastic. In another way, our brain is plastic, or you can think extraordinarily plastic, because the dendritic spines or the synapses that present are continuously changing depending on the activity of the neuron. So this change actually happens depending on the kind of activity that neuron receives. But at this point, at least you understand that the dendritic spine structure, which is present in the axons or in the dendron, they are continuously changing in our brain. So you can think how the hardware structure in our brain can change, and that's the fundamental basis of the plasticity in our brain. And that's why you can do anything that you can remember. We never feel that our brain has a limited capacity. Anyway, this is how the power of a Golgi stain. And that's I told you this very old stain. And now I'm showing you today, this is today's era. Nowadays, you can visualize whatever the spines that you saw here, dendritic spines, in a live animal, in a live species by using a microscope That's called two-photon microscope that we have in our IIT. Okay, so it's owner is one of the faculty in EC, Dr. Sarva Bandyopadhyay. Okay, so by using two-photon microscopy, you can visualize the dynamic nature of this dendritic spine. So if you just look at this is some of the neurons here in the cortical areas, cerebral cortex, and if you just magnify this small part, you can see here, you'll be able to visualize the dendritic spines. This dot legs, some protrusions in the structure. Now, if you see the time scale, so now you give a task. This is showing picture here. So if you give a task to the mice to do something, to drink water, to give some smell so that they're active or they sense something, at the same time you monitor the dendritic spine structure, and you'll be able to see whenever they do some task, some of the specific dendritic spine are highly mature and stable. You see this big structure. On the other hand, some of the dendritic spines are actually retracting, just disappearing, and so on. So that tells you, depending on the kind of activity or kind of neuronal activity you can think about, or kind of task that you do, inside your brain, the specific areas of your brain are constantly changing, and the dendritic spines, maybe some of the dendritic spines might be forming, some of the dendritic spines might be lost. In other way, you can see some of the synapses are strongly, stable. Some of the synapses may be very weak, eliminated over time. And then you can think, if synapses are more and more stable, you can think more and more number of synapses means more and more number of connections, more and more circuits. Okay, so for a specific task, you make not only the stable synapse, at the same time you make a stable circuit for that specific task or for that specific memory. That's how we are able to store. So you can think about now, we are able to store any memory in the form of a new synapse, or you can think in the form of a new circuit. Okay, I hope that's clear, at least to basic aspect, very clear. But the most fascinating part, you can think in a live animal, you can do anything. So you give a task to the mice to do, and at the same time you can record. You can just use the microscope objectives. You can visualize and see what is happening in the brain. Okay, so that's very most advanced way you can think. Okay, now let's come back to some of the other aspect. Let me first talk about how actually neurons generate electrical signal. Okay, so whenever you see some object, whenever you hear some sound, or somebody touches you, you feel it. How it happens? So you think about a photon light, a wave, sound wave, or even a mechanical touch. They all are at the end are able. It's converted to electrical signals. So how that happens? So let's start from the beginning. So if you think about your neuronal membrane, in normal circumstances, when neurons are just in resting state, they maintain a polarity. So there's a potential difference exists in the membrane, and that's called resting membrane potential. That's about 60 to 70 millivolt. And if you look at, this is the membrane structure. So this is the inner side and this is the outer side. So in outer side, there is a very high level of sodium ion compared to inner side. So it's mentioned here about 12 times higher sodium concentration outside than the inside. And if you look at the potassium ion, they are actually highly concentrated in inner side than the outer side. But other than that, chloride ion, as well as there are a lot of different kind of proteins that is present inside your cell that makes different kind of charge. And at the end, the net charge, if you look at the net charge outside and load charge inside, so the inside is the negative charge. Net charge in the inner surface is negative. So the resting membrane potential are around -60, -10 because it's the negative side. Inner side is the negative, is about -60 to -70 millivolt, and this is maintained because in the membrane, in the neuronal membrane, there are different kinds of channels, ion channels that's present. You can look at it, says potassium ion leak channel, sodium ion leak channel. They are present in the membrane along with sodium potassium ATPase pump. So in normal circumstances, this leak channel will, it will work in a concentration gradient. If the potassium ion concentration is higher in the inside the cell, so obviously it can just leak through potassium leak channel and goes out. Similarly, sodium ion is highly present. Concentration is higher in outside. So therefore, the sodium leak channel can allow them to go inside. So to try to maintain an equilibrium condition, but that don't happen because there is a sodium potassium pump. Whenever there is a disbalance, when there is the type equilibrium, this channel leak channel try to equilibrate sodium or potassium ion, this pump actually come into play, and they actually uses ATP, and in the pump work, it actually pump out 3 sodium ion and pump in 2 potassium ion, and thereby making a difference. They are always making a polarity in the membrane. Okay, and this is the pump requires extensive amount of energy because this actually works against the concentration gradient. Okay, because you see the sodium ion concentration inside the cell is lower than the outside. So it has to pump out against the concentration gradient. Therefore, it requires huge amount of energy. And I mentioned here, the majority of the energy that our brain actually use to operate this kind of pump, and thereby always try to maintain a normal resting potential that is about -60 to -70 millivolt. And whenever you feel, if someone does what you call fasting, it's a long time you don't have any sugar because brain is entirely dependent on the sugar. Okay, it don't actually simple sugar. It don't actually store glycogen. So brain is completely depends on glucose. Therefore, if you do fasting for longer time, and whenever your sugar level drops, the first thing that actually hits you actually this sodium and potassium pump, because the sugar is not able to metabolize and give you energy. So that's why you sometimes feel very, very dizzy and very weak whenever you do fasting. Okay, I hope that's clear. So this is how the resting membrane potential is maintained in neuronal membrane under normal circumstances. But here I have mentioned only few channels. I'll come up with some other channels, but these are the channels: sodium ion leak channel, potassium ion leak channel, and sodium potassium ATPase pump. These are the channels are primarily involved in maintaining resting membrane potential. Okay, let's go to the next step. So then the question is, so that how the electrical signal is generated in response to various stimulus. It can be light, photon, it can be your wave, or it can be different kind of touch, temperature, chemicals, whatever it is, whatever you can think. Okay, so just think about in case of light. Take an example of light. So when the light hits in your eyes, so your retina has a specific type of photoreceptor cell that's called rod and cone. I am sure most of you probably know about it. So those cells get activated. Just think about, and those cells, when they get activated by photon, there's a specific type of receptor. Activated means there are specific type of receptor that activated and that allow sodium ion goes in. That's the case. You can see in this picture, there's another example showing here. This is the case of taste. Whenever you feel some sweet, bitter, sour, whatever taste you are feeling, just think of sugar. So you take a sugar and you feel sweet. So sugar molecule will come and bind, see here, with a specific receptor that present on your tongue. Okay, taste bud in your tongue, and they will activate those receptors. Once this receptor is activated, this is called actually this ligand gated channel. It's a different kind of channel. We'll be talking more details about this later. But just think, when the sugar or any other chemical molecule bounds to the receptor get activated, and that causes entry of sodium ion. So sodium ion just flooded in. You know, the outside there are a lot of sodium, so sodium can just goes in. Now think your inside the membrane was about minus 60 to minus 70, say minus 60 millivolt. And now more and more sodium goes in. So that will lead to drop of the potential, right? So it might come minus 50, minus 55 and so on. It may go to plus. I hope it is clear to you. So it can be happening for anything. It can be, this is in case of some different kind of taste. You can think in case of smell, small molecule. When you take a nice smell, got a nice smell. So some molecules present in that, whatever chemical that is present in that, whatever that reagents you used or that you used. So that chemicals will go and binds with a specific receptor in your nose, and thereby can activate the receptor, and at the end there is an influx of entry of sodium ion inside the neuronal cell. Now that's clear. So I just gave you the example of there are different kinds of receptor. Even somebody touches you, the same thing happens. There's a mechanoreceptor present in your skin. So those receptors will be activated, and that lead to entry of sodium ion. Okay. So once sodium ion goes in, now think sodium ion now goes in inside the cell, and thereby try to depolarize. So neuronal membrane was polarized, say minus 60 millivolt, and because of the entry of plus charges, your inside get a more and more plus. So you just think about it. If you look at this graph here, so it is minus 70 normal state, and when more and more sodium ion goes in, so peak is gradually dropping the potential, and then once it's reached a certain level, like this is showing a threshold level, that's a minus 55 millivolt. So when the resting membrane potential reached a threshold value, which is about minus 55 millivolt, at that potential, once it reaches that potential, suddenly there is a shoot off of the membrane potential. It may reach to plus 35, plus 40, and then it again drops. This is the potential. So this actually make a sharp peak, and that's how the current generates and flow. And this is so fast, it's often called the spike, and this is called actually action potential. So the action potential has different phase. First is depolarization phase, the dropping phase is called repolarization, and then hyperpolarization, and so on. Now the question is how these things happens. Let's try to understand why suddenly it stood up. So, and I told you, once it's reached a threshold potential, once the membrane, neuronal membrane reached a threshold potential like minus 55 millivolt, at that potential, there is a specific channel. It's called voltage gated ion channel, because depending on the voltage, that channel now open. So this channel is called voltage gated sodium channel. So at threshold value, voltage gated sodium channel suddenly opens, and that leads to flooding in of lots of sodium ion inside the cell. And that's why it stood up. And it reaches certain stage, and immediately that receptor get desensitized. It's just a moment, it just releases a lot of sodium ion inside the cell, and in a moment the channel gets inactivated. Okay, and then so it just stops somewhere in the peak, and then there's another channel that's activated at this peak, say plus 35 millivolt. There is another voltage gated channel get activated. That's a voltage gated potassium channel, and that causes a dropping of this peak. But I hope that will come back. I will come back sequentially. I will show you all the event gradually how it happens. But I hope it's clear that threshold potential is very, very important. So once it reaches the threshold potential, the voltage gated sodium channel get activated, allowing lots of sodium inside the cell. That's why this peak happens. And once it reaches threshold, so it just get a peak. So that's why it's called all or none law. So the action potential follow all or none. So it reaches threshold, then only it shoot up. If it don't reach, nothing will happen. It don't fire. Okay, so this is called the action potential. Okay, so now you just see what I told is sequentially. You can just think about the various ionic event. So minus 70 millivolt is the membrane resting potential. Once it starts depolarizing because of the activity of the receptor, sodium ion fast going in, and once it happens, when it crosses the threshold value, say minus 55 millivolt, then this sodium, voltage gated sodium channel, you can see here, is opened. So that leads to flooding of calcium ion, sodium ion in. So you can see that leads to the rise of the peak. And I mentioned you just a moment, this channel, so voltage gated sodium channel, get desensitized. So just showing here the gate is now getting closed. Suddenly gate is closed, so sodium ion cannot enter anymore. So it reached sudden peak, say plus 35 millivolt, plus 30 millivolt. At that stage, voltage gated sodium channel just closed. So no more sodium ion entering. So peak stops here, and that is the voltage. Say around plus 30, plus 35 millivolt. That is the voltage. It is the threshold potential to activate voltage gated potassium ion channel. So now voltage gated potassium channel opens, and once that happens, potassium ion actually goes out of the cell. Just a reverse process. So once the voltage gated potassium channel is open or activated, the potassium ion goes out. That leads to the dropping of the peak. So the inner sides getting much more gradually repolarized, okay, coming back to its normal stage. So peak is falling down, and at some point it is coming back to normal. So this is how the event takes place. Okay, and you can always think the action potential can travel forward direction. I hope that's clear. Because one of the most important thing here is this sodium channel, which is open depending on the voltage. That's first point. That's why it's called voltage gated sodium channel. And second point is it's very quickly desensitized. Okay. So the gate is closed moment, and that's why the action potential cannot come backwards. It always can go forward direction. Because there's a refractory, there's a recovery stage is required for that. And now if you look at in just a normal circumference, bigger perspective. So this is just a neuron. You can think how action potential can travel. So you can see here, this is how it happens. So red one is action potential, just yellow one is the refractory membrane, the time when the recovery is taking place, and that's how the action potential can travel in a membrane. Now if you think in our brain, there are two kinds of neuron. One is called unmyelinated neuron, where there is no myelin sheath in the axonic area. But there is another group of neurons where there is a myelin sheath. See that the thick insulating layer, and if you look at the Hermann integration image here, and there is a node of Ranvier in between. There is a thick myelin coating that acts as an insulator, but in between there is a gap. Typically, neuronal membrane can be naked here. So in this case, you can think how action potential can travel. So all those channels that will be presenting only in these areas, only this is node of Ranvier area. So therefore, the potential. So suppose action potential is generated here, and then it has to next go to here. So the sodium ion, whatever the high level of sodium ion inside the cell, once it reaches to another node, it will gradually dilute. But this will be enough to make, enough for causing threshold potential. So it should not be less than minus 55 millivolt. It could be more than minus 55 millivolt, and therefore action potential can generate here. So action potential can travel from node to node. So therefore, it can increase the speed of action potential. So the purpose of myelin sheath here is to increase the speed of nerve impulse. Okay, so this kind of conduction is often called saltatory conduction or jumping current. So now I just want to mention one disease that is caused by the problem of myelin sheath. If there is some reason the myelin sheath are damaged, there are certain times, some cases, myelin sheath might be damaged because of either viral infection or some unknown cause. That disease that's called multiple sclerosis. It's very, very uncommon in India, but this multiple sclerosis can be very common in various European countries in colder climate area. It's very common, but in India it's somehow surprisingly very, very low. But you can see those patients. So just to know, this disease can happen because of the damage of the myelin sheath. Now you can guess what kind of problem the patient can have. So if myelin sheath is not there, so you can think the nerve impulse speed could be much higher. Sorry, much slower. And this myelinated, I forgot one thing to mention. In our central nervous system, like inside your brain, typically brain, majority of the neurons are actually unmyelinated. While in peripheral nervous system, like your hands, legs, okay, so those are the places your neurons are actually myelinated. Just think about your longest neuron. You can think about your longest neuron, the spinal cord to your hands, or spinal cord from spinal cord to your legs. These are some of the longest neuron. Spinal cord to your legs, that's a neuron is called the nerve fiber, that is called the sciatic nerve. So they are the most longest neuron that you can think. So if the information from your toes has to come to your brain, think a long route, long distance. So obviously you need to speed up the nerve impulse. Therefore, you must need myelin sheath. That's what it is there. So most peripheral nervous system has thick myelin sheath. But in case of disease, this multiple sclerosis, if these myelin sheaths are not there, so nerve impulse will be very, very slow. So there people might not be able to sense, or people might be having paralysis. So you can understand the multiple sclerosis patients will not be able to, move their hands or legs properly. So they can't sense. The neuron cannot be, information from those neurons cannot reach to the brain quickly. So that's one of the major problems that multiple sclerosis patient can exhibit. Well, so now some of the interesting things, just think. So if you just compare the speed of nerve impulse between myelinated and non-myelinated neuron, you can think how much speed can be increased because of the myelination. Several-fold. You can think 80 to 120 miles per second in case of myelinated neuron, but non-myelinated neuron that is present in your brain, about 0.5 to 2 miles per second. Very, very slow. And now if you compare the speed of nerve impulse versus the speed of our electricity, it is just not comparable. Nerve impulse could be 3 million times slower than electricity. This is just to give you some rough idea how the speed can be so different. Okay, here are some of the different stories. So now think you heard about voltage gated sodium channel, which is very much involved in generating action potential, and so the nerve impulse, right? Without voltage gated sodium channel, you can't think that action potential can be generated. Or in other sense, a neuron can be firing, neuron can be activated and fired. Okay, so now think there are some poison. Like in this case, I'm showing here a fish that's called a puffer fish. Okay, so this puffer fish, there is a poison gland they have, and the poison gland have a molecules, the poisons, the most poisonous molecules, that's called tetrodotoxin. This is just to show you the structure. So tetrodotoxin is the strong inhibitor of voltage gated sodium channel. You can understand if they block the sodium channel, you can understand you will die. Not a single neuron will be able to fire. So at the end, you can think what will happen. And this tetrodotoxin is considered even more poisonous than the cyanide, potassium cyanide. It's an irreversible blocker. So once it binds to the voltage-gated sodium channel, it just stay there. And just for your information, this is one of the fish. In Japan, it's considered the most delicate, most tastiest food. Okay, so if you ever, I'm sure many of you might land up in Japan in your future career. They'll find out there are some restaurant which will sell this fish. Dish of this fish, and you will be amazed to think that time, how can people take a risk of life by eating this fish? But there are certain standard fish shops, they sell this, and that's most probably damn expensive dish, as you can see in Japan. But for you to remember this tetrodotoxin, more poisonous than the cyanide. Okay, now we come back and see there's another weak, very weak and reversible blocker, of this voltage gated sodium channel, and that actually we can see them in commonly day-to-day purpose. I'm sure many of you probably have dental pain some point, and you went to a dentist, and if there's an emergency, then the dentist might do something, look at maybe some removing the tooth or something, and in that case, dentist invariably will give a local injection, and within probably 10-15 minutes, you will not sense anything in your mouth. That's actually doctor actually injects a local anesthetics. Local anesthesia, so that makes you senseless, and you can understand that local anesthetics is nothing but a lidocaine. So this is a weak and reversible blocker of voltage gated sodium channel. You can understand why if anybody have any experience, now you can understand. So the action might stay about 2-3 hours. If doctor inject your mouth, some part of your mouth will be completely anesthetized. You will not have any sense, probably 2-3 hours, and then it will gradually come back. So that tells you how if you block sodium channel, voltage gated sodium channel, what could be the outcome? This is a reversible blocker. Now, if you think about irreversible blocker, so it will be if you just inject a irreversible blocker, you can understand it will be just senseless for a longer time. Okay, these are some of the things, might be exciting things you might consider to remember. Okay, so this is how. So what I told is how the nerve impulse can travels, how it generates and then travels from one part to another, right? From if it generates somewhere in the dendrites, so it will go and at least end part of the neuron through axon. But the problem comes if there is a gap. So if one neuron is connected with another neuron by means of a small gap, that's called the synapse, then the question comes how the information can go in that gap. In other words, how the information from one neuron can go to the other neuron through this gap. There's a problem, right? So this is the guy, these two guys have solved this problem and got the Nobel Prize in 1936. Okay, so this is Otto Loewi. I mean, this is some of the I don't have time really to talk about his experiment, but some of you might be interested to see why it's so important is when he was a PhD student, he did something wrong. When he was doing something, he did terribly wrong doing some experiment, and this wrongdoing actually made a landmark discovery. So that's why you guys can look at what is his experiment, what is kind of experiment what he did. But at the end, their work, continuous work, led to the discovery of a substance, chemical substance, that actually act as a neurotransmitter, or we sometimes call this chemical neurotransmitter, chemical molecule that actually works in this gap and thereby can transfer the information from one neuron to another neuron. Okay, so electrical signal, if in summary, when the electrical signal comes the end of this first neuron, that's the end of the axon or axon terminals, the terminals release some chemicals that's called neurotransmitter. The chemicals goes released from within this gap and then binds with the second neurons, dendrite of the second neuron, and thereby you can excite the second neuron. That's how the information goes from one neuron to another neuron. Or in other words, one neuron can excite another neuron. So there are several different neurotransmitters has been discovered. I just mentioned few of them. The red one that you see here, they are called excitatory neurotransmitter. The acetylcholine is the first discovered neurotransmitter discovered by these two guys. And then dopamine, serotonin, glutamate. So the acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that can be found in your nerve muscle junction. When your muscle contracts, I'll give you some example. This is the neurotransmitter playing a role. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that plays important role in keeping you motivated, energetic. Okay, goal achieved. So this is very important for you guys. And the serotonin, that's keep you cool, keep you smooth. I mean, what I'll say, calm and quiet. It's a very good neurotransmitter. And the glutamate, you know, this is the amino acid. It's excited as the amino acid. And this is the amino acid neurotransmitter is involved in learning and memory. So we're talking deeply in all those guys. And the green one that you see here, they are the inhibitory neurotransmitter. The red one is the excitatory, the green one is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. Okay, I'll just give you a flow chart so you can see here. Oh. Anyway, so you will be having the slides. So if you will slideshow mode, then you will be able to see the systematically how the information from one neuron goes to other neuron. You'll be able to see. I'll just try to explain this. I cannot show in PowerPoint mode. So you just see this is the end terminals of a presynaptic neuron. This is called synaptic node. So the neuronal end or axonal tips of the first neuron, which is having lots of neurochemicals, the neurotransmitters stored in this is vesicles, small vesicles. They are filled with this neurotransmitter. Once the axon potential arrives at the tip, or once the neuron getting fired, the axon potential generated, it arrives at tips, it releases calcium ion inside the cell. And that calcium ion helps to fuse these vesicles to release their content. You see the content is released. This is I am talking too deeply. There are a lot of steps are happening. And once this neurotransmitter released, bounds with the receptor present in the postsynaptic neuron. So this is called presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. Once the neurotransmitter bounds with this receptor present in the postsynaptic neuron, the postsynaptic neuron now getting activated. In other words, axon potential is generated in the postsynaptic neuron. I hope that's the summary of this. This sequence is clearly mentioned stepwise. Okay. So this is somehow some of the aspect again continuation of that. I'll just try to explain this. Just think about this is the synapse. So this is the presynaptic neuron. So I'm just trying to explain here is once the neurotransmitter bounds to its specific receptor in the postsynaptic membrane, okay, it activates this postsynaptic neuron. That's what it is. So during the process, it will generate axon potential in the postsynaptic neuron. Now I am explaining you how it happens. Just think about this is the presynaptic neuron is firing. So there is axon potential. It's coming at the end of this tip. That's the presynaptic end. Okay, that's where is your synapse. Okay, so now at the end, in the synapse, it will release neurotransmitter. And thereby neurotransmitter will bound with this is the postsynaptic neuron and can generate axon potential in this neuron. So if you put an electrode, you'll be able to measure the voltage. And if you do that, so you can see if this neuron getting fired or getting activated, you'll be able to measure the potential change. In normal circumstances, the voltage was say about minus 60 millivolt. Once this neuron getting activated, after binding with the neurotransmitter, there is a change of voltage. And in this case, this voltage is named different ways. So it's called excitatory postsynaptic potential. But this is nothing but axon potential, but it is a different name. Excitatory postsynaptic potential. Okay, so you can see the generation of this. It can be graded depending on the how much axon potential, how strong axon potential, or how frequently they are coming. Depending on that, how much neurotransmitter will be released. Depending on that, your EPSP magnitude will depend. So EPSP, whatever you see here, EPSP magnitude depends on at the end how much neurotransmitter is released. If there is a low amount of neurotransmitter, it could be low. If there is more neurotransmitter, it could be higher. Okay. So this is the ionic event. It is same thing what I told you earlier. Okay. So once the neurotransmitter bounds to its receptor, this is the receptor and this is the neurotransmitter. So once it's, again these are all animated, so you can see that once it's bounds, you can see here sodium ion goes in and potassium ion goes out. That leads to depolarization. In this case, its cause is mentioned as hypopolarization because it's graded. That's why it's mentioned as hypopolarization. So gradually, polarity will change. At some point, it will be like action potential. in this case called excited postsynaptic potential. So sodium and potassium ion. Sodium ion goes in, potassium ion goes out. But if the neurotransmitter, what I mentioned is here in this case, if the neurotransmitter is excitatory, then there will be a generation of excitatory postsynaptic potential. If the neurotransmitter is inhibitory, say GABA or glycine, in that case, in this postsynaptic neuron, there will be generation of IPSP. IPSP stands for inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Okay, so this neuron will be inhibited. So this is how we can think about it. So depending on the type of neurotransmitter, a postsynaptic neuron will be either excited, generation of EPSP. A postsynaptic neuron can be inhibited because there is generation of IPSP. So in case of IPSP, there is a completely different ionic event take place. So in case of IPSP, chloride ion goes in and potassium ion come out. Because of the entry of chloride ion, the membrane of the inside getting more and more negatively charged, right? Because in normal circumstances, inside of the membrane is negative. Now more and more chloride ion goes in, so that leads to more and more negative inside. That's called hyperpolarization, and that's why there is no depolarization. So that's why the neurons getting inhibited. That's called inhibitory postsynaptic potential. I think I'll give probably a gap, right? Do I want a gap for 2-3 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
I'll just give you a gap.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll just give you a gap. Go and wash your eyes, drink water, and come back. I'll do the same thing.
Sir, I had a question.
Yes, go on.
Sir, what is the benefit of IPSP in our body? Like if there is no potential only then, and when there is IPSP, so what will be like difference between those two cases?
Your voice is cracking. So you mean you tell me once more? What's the question? Hello?
Sir, like when there is inhibitory postsynaptic potential,
Right.
and like when there is like that neuron is not activated at all, right? So if I like don't give any like signal in that neuron versus when I am sending GABA or something, so what kind of like difference does the two scenarios?
Okay, so you
like
think,
what is?
no, I got your point. So in that case, so what your question is, suppose a neuron is in a resting state. So the membrane potential could be -60 to -70 millivolt. That's maintaining. Now, if there is IPSP, right? If the generation of IPSP, so there will be more and more minus. So -70 may go -80, -90, minus something like that. So in that case, so I didn't mention that, it is a little complicated. So that is another form of excitation. I mean, another form of firing a neuron. Although the neurons are inhibited, I am talking about because they are inhibited neurotransmitter, but this is another way to think that is a kind of signal is generated. I am going to give you expansion because it's not a resting potential. Resting potential is dropping and dropping and dropping and leads to so much of hyperpolarization. Of course, it's not depolarization, it's a hyperpolarization. So in that condition, neuron also can be activated by other ways. So in that condition, inside the neuron, there are many signal cascade will be going on because of too much of chloride ion inside. Okay, so I think after sometimes you will be able to understand a little bit. So once too much of chloride ion goes inside the cell, one thing is, I think it's clear that the voltage will be dropping, right, inside. So there will be a huge gap. Voltage difference is increasing, right, because the inner side is more and more negative charge. Although it's -72, it might reach to -100. So there's an increasing gap, voltage difference. And that concentration of chloride ion inside the neuron can lead to a lot of signaling changes. And at the end, they will have huge impact on the activity of the neuron. It may not affect your action potential. I'm talking about neuronal firing. but it will leads to a lot of changes inside the neuron, even without changing the potential, like without firing. But that's a very, very extreme scenario. This kind of thing happens because you have to think about where those inhibitory neurons are present. So inhibitory neurons usually present or usually innervates in excited neuron. I mean, to control the excitation. So in our brain, there could be what I'll say. I don't have picture. There are excited neurons. There are excited neurons that are continuously firing, and if you have to control the, or if you have to monitor their firing rate, because a neuron cannot fire it is whatever way it can. It has to be very controlled way. Whenever you do your any activity, all the activities are very controlled way you do because your neuronal firing are very controlled. And to control that, you need inhibition because at any point they may not cross certain limit. So therefore, the inhibitory innervations or inhibitory neurons are present in those places mostly to control the activations of excited neuron. So therefore, the example that you said, this it happens, but very different. I mean, very rare cases this kind of scenario will be able to see. Or in other sense, or in other way, you can think a inhibitory neuron would be only activated, or those channels, whatever I am showing here, can be only taking place or only activated once once there is a need to inhibit an excitatory neuron. Am I able to explain or am I able to clear to you? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I think I'm already done probably, right? I can start probably because 1 hour is left. Anybody have any questions? Well, probably I will start it. I will start again. Let other guys come maybe. So I think we can start. So what we talked about generation, once the neurotransmitter bounds with specific receptor in the postsynaptic neuron, it can generate either excitatory postsynaptic potential or inhibitory postsynaptic potential depending on the neurotransmitter. Okay. So then what kind of receptors are there? So they have to bind with the receptor once it released from their terminals, presynaptic terminals. So there, if you look at the structure or function of the receptor, you can broadly classify them into categories. So one groups that we just now talked about are the ion channels. Okay. Activity of which can lead to EPSP or IPSP. So one group of receptors are called the ligand-gated channels, ion channels. They are commonly called ionotropic. So ionotropic means the channel. There is another group of receptors that's called the metabotropic type, which are nothing but a G-protein coupled receptor, a specific receptor that's bound with the membrane. Very difficult for you probably to remember these things, but if you can remember. So one thing you have to remember that once the channel is activated, like ionotropic type, the things will be very fast. The metabotropic type, that's what I was just mentioning in somebody's question. So they are actually causes some changes inside the cell metabolism. So there are a lot of changes inside. They may not cause any, may not influence some action potential, but they may lead to a lot of signaling changes inside the cell. So that's why they're actually a little bit slow process. Ionotropic type act very fast. The metabotropic type it takes some time to produce some event. They are called G protein coupled receptor. If you want to know a little more details, so G protein coupled, this is the typical receptor that binds with the G protein. That's why it's called G protein coupled receptor. And a G protein coupled receptor by default will have 7 transmembrane spanning domains. This structure is it is very, very unique. So G protein bounds with that. That's why it's called G protein coupled receptor. Okay, so that's how two group of receptor you can find out. Whatever neurotransmitter today you see, they can be working in these two kinds of receptor. That's clear. So now I'm just coming to give you very, very interesting aspect and a little bit confusing also probably for you. Just think about the first discovered neurotransmitter. We'll be talking about first discovered neurotransmitter, that's acetylcholine. And I also pointed out it is the neurotransmitter primarily works in your nerve muscle junction. So just think when your muscle, your hand or leg muscle contract, when you're moving your hand, so there are neurons that actually innervated with the muscles. So those neurons carry, or when those neurons fire, or when those neurons action potential travels through those neurons, when it reaches towards the end terminals that is connected with the muscle, it releases the acetylcholine. So now muscle junction releases acetylcholine. Then acetylcholine will work in the muscle membrane and generate action potential there, and thereby will allow to contract the muscle. So that's how it happens. That's how your muscle contracts. I'm talking about hands or leg muscles like skeletal muscles. That's how it contracts. And that's a very simple process. Okay, so this is just to show you innervations, how a nerve ends and innervates with the muscle. If you look at that little bit detailed structure, this is how it is. So muscle membrane invaginates, and a lot of neurotransmitter will be there inside this end terminals, and they will be released, and so on. I mentioned already. So once they bound with a specific receptor type, then it will activate those receptor, finally generate action potential, and the muscle will contract. Now the problem is this acetylcholine receptor that is present in the skeletal muscle. This is the most important part. The acetylcholine receptor that is present in the skeletal muscle, like hand, legs, like this muscle, that muscle type, that receptor is called nicotinic type of receptor, and is a kind of ionotropic type. You can think about, so this is channel. So the acetylcholine receptor that present in the muscle, skeletal muscle particularly, that is a ionotropic type. It has given different name, nicotinic type, because the nicotine that present in the tobacco, people who smokes, a lot of nicotines actually they inhale. So the nicotine actually bounds with this receptor and can mimic the activity of the receptor. So that's why it is called nicotinic type of receptor, acetylcholine receptor. People who smokes, when they take a lot of nicotine can goes and binds with this kind of neuromuscular junction, and thereby can cause the activation of the, so the muscle can abnormally contract. People who are smoker, chain smoker, continuously smokes, so you will be able to see sometimes the sex and the other hands and other parts, sometimes mostly the hand, other part of the body, sometimes sex, and thus continuously activate some skeletal muscles. But anyway, that's the different parts. But think about why they have been given name nicotinic type. They are channel. Because the nicotine acts as an agonist, I'm telling a different terminology, agonist, agent that will bounce to the receptor and activate the receptor. That is called agonist. If it antagonizes the receptor activity, then it's called antagonist. So nicotine here is an agonist of acetylcholine receptor. So now we look at this here. If you are in the campus, I'm sure this your second year batch, right? You must have you already probably experienced the IIT Kharagpur campus, right? Most of you, all of you probably were here. It's not the first year, not been experienced the campus. So anyway, so you must have seen or come across this campus. I think a lot of snakes you might be able to see. So this is one of the type of snake that's called cobra snake. It's the most dangerous, probably the most poisonous snake. This cobra snake venom is often called alpha. It consists molecules that's called alpha bungarotoxin. You don't have to remember the name, but just remember the king cobra snake venom having a molecule consists a molecule that binds to this receptor and can block the activity of the receptor. That's very important. So nicotinic is the agonist, while cobra snake venom is an antagonist of acetylcholine receptor. So now you can understand how this venom can cause problem, can be deadly. So if snake bites, it obviously release in that nearby area a lot of its venom, and that venom will have agent that's called alpha bungar toxin. So they will go and bind with this neurotransmitter receptor, nicotinic type of neurotransmitter receptor, and therefore the receptor, so what will happen? The muscle at the end will not be able to contract. Okay, so because they are antagonizing the activity of the receptor, so muscle will not be able to contract. So at the end, muscle will paralyze. Okay, and if it spread different parts of your body, there's more problem. So that's why if you can localize this, so if you not allow fast spread, sometimes people use just minimize the spread, so that the local area can be paralyzed, but it will not reach the other part. But most often it's not happens. But don't do fast spread in the beginning. It might reach to different parts of the body and thereby can collapse you. But you understand how cobra snake venom can work. That's very important. Okay, so it's an antagonist of acetylcholine receptor, nicotinic type of acetylcholine receptor. So now I'll give you another example. It's completely opposite. Now think in the case of heart, how our system has evolved with so complication. So if you look at the case of heart and nerve junction, so our heart also controlled. The rhythmicity of our heart is also controlled by a different nerve, sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve. So in this case, the contraction or relaxation of the heart muscles is controlled by different neurotransmitter. But acetylcholine is also nerve muscle junctions, right? So in the nerve muscle junction, acetylcholine is released, and the release of acetylcholine in the heart muscle is actually causes completely opposite effect than the skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, it causes contraction, right? Don't get confused. But in heart muscle, acetylcholine causes relaxation. That's the opposite, completely opposite effect. So now you can ask how a same receptor, a same neurotransmitter can do this two different kind of effect. In one muscle contraction, another muscle relaxation. That because it has a different type of receptor present in the heart and in the skeletal muscle. You saw in case of skeletal muscle, it was the nicotinic type of receptor, that is a channel. But in case of heart muscle, it is called muscarinic type of receptor, and it is G-protein coupled. It's completely different type of receptor. So it's muscarinic type and G-protein coupled. As it's slow. Now, question is why muscarinic? There's another problem here. You saw these pictures. Even in IIT campus, you might be able to see a lot of such colorful mushroom. This colorful mushroom means you should never ever try to test. Most colorful mushroom means it's a problem. It could be deadly. It is not could be. I think it is deadly. Okay, so this mushroom are deadly because the agent, chemical agent that is present in this mushroom is called muscarine. Okay, so this muscarine is actually a agonist of acetylcholine receptor that present in your heart. And this is called muscarinic. That's why it's called muscarinic type, the G-protein coupled receptor. Which means once this muscarinic, if you take by chance take this kind of mushroom, maybe the muscarine is present, this muscarine will go to your body, bounds with acetylcholine receptor, that's the G-protein coupled type, acetylcholine receptor in the heart, and thereby can mimic the activity. Mimic means in this case heart will slow down because it causes relaxation of your heart muscle, which means your heartbeat will slow down. So by chance, if you have taken this poisonous mushroom, over the time your heartbeat may slow down. At some point it may even stop. So that's why it's more deadly, very deadly actually. Okay, I hope you got the point. But the bottom line here is now you understand. So acetylcholine, depending on its receptor type, have a different kind of activity in different muscle. I'm repeating again, in skeletal muscle, it causes contraction because the receptor type that present is is nicotinic type. On the other hand, in a heart muscle, it causes relaxation because the receptor type that is present is called muscarinic type. Okay. There are many examples you can think. Even if you see many times when you go for a eye test, sometimes before testing eyes, doctor put a drop of some drop solution. It's called atropine, and after sometimes you feel bad, bitter taste in your mouth. If you have undergone such kind of test, then you can understand that the drug that is used is called atropine. It actually causes relaxation of your eye muscles, so the doctor can see any kind of problem that they want to see. The same way it works, like heart muscles. Okay, and a lot of example you can find out. Even earlier days, the old time people used to use some bow, kill their prey, kill their animal. Even in battlefield, people used to use some bow, and the tip of the arrow actually used to have some kind of poison. That's nothing but some kind of poison that causes the inactivation of this kind of receptors. Okay. So there are a lot of use of and abuse of this agent that can work to acetylcholine receptor. I hope I gave you some sense of acetylcholine. Now let's come to glutaminergic synapse. As I told you, glutamate is one of the important amino acid. Glutamate and aspartic acid. Glutamic acid and aspartic acid, they are the two acidic amino acid. And here you will be seeing that they are the most important neurotransmitter that plays important role in learning and memory formation. I'm sure many of you probably interested to know. So that's what the disease. So the glutamate and aspartate are the neurotransmitter linked with your memory formation. But the amazing thing is you have 20 amino acids, and among them, 2 of the amino acids, the acidic amino acid, is acting in a neurotransmitter. That's surprising, and why not others? Anyway, that's a different aspect. But if you look at how they are involved, how this glutamate or aspartate is involved in learning and memory formation, it's too complex. I try to give a very simplified views. Just think first how this synapse works, glutaminergic synapse works. So this is the presynaptic neuron, and this is the postsynaptic neuron, and nearby there is a glial cell. So I don't think about complexities. Just think, avoid at this moment. This is the pre and this is post, and this is presynaptic neuron. So once the axonal potential comes here, the glutamate or aspartate that present in the vesicles, so it will be released here. Okay, glutamate is released, bound to its postsynaptic neuron, and thereby can activate the postsynaptic neuron. That's clear. That's actually happens for every neurotransmitter, but the same thing. Okay, so now the complexity is, if you think about glutamate receptor, forget about aspartate. I'm not just consider only glutamate receptor. There are 3 different. Of course, they have ionotropic type and metabotropic type of receptor. And if you think of an ionotropic type, there are 3 different ionotropic type of receptor: NMDA, AMPA, kinase, and that's why the complexity coming. So the full name is written in the bottom. So it's NMDA means N-methyl D-aspartic acid, something like that. Just think they have an ionotropic type and they have a metabotropic type, and you know the ionotropic type of the channel, the metabotropic type of the receptor from G-protein couple, and all these ionotropic and metabotropic type are involved in learning and memory process. Okay. And you see how it happens. This is just to give a best simplified view. So I already mentioned you earlier that when I talked about the synaptic, dendritic spines, that time I mentioned the dendritic spines are very dynamic. They are constantly produced and constantly eliminated depending on the activity of the neuron. If the neurons are activated constantly with a particular interval, I'm not giving some precise things. If the neurons are activated in a specific interval with a specific magnitude, then depending on the signal strength, depending on how frequently they are coming, the changes that takes place in the postsynaptic neuron is completely different. Okay, first thing, I was talking about that. So depending on the strength or firing rate of the neuron, you will be able to see either formation of the new spine or elimination of the new spine. So depending on, I'm talking about how frequently, how much strength it is having, and how much duration it is taking. If there is too much of gap between them, you might be able to see the disappearance of the synapse. Okay, so these are all dependent. So now here the different things. So that's why you are seeing the different, I mean, how the synapses are forming and eliminating. But before that, this is the things actually happens. So now we think, so this is the presynaptic neuron and this is the postsynaptic neuron, right? So these two neurons are constantly active. That's think a scenario. So this neuron is firing, it's releasing its neurotransmitter called NMDA, your glutamate, just think glutamate, and this postsynaptic neurons having its receptor, the NMDA AMPA as I mentioned, so they will be binding here and the postsynaptic neuron getting activated. Now, if this neuron are firing constantly with a specific interval, then there is a change happens in this postsynaptic neuron. You just see the changes. So this is the pre-LTP. I'm talking LTP is long-term potential. Just think about normal circumstances. This is the thing happening. It's just normally happening. Now this neuron is firing constantly, repeatedly with a specific gap interval. There is a change happens in the postsynaptic neuron. You see some of the receptors become more and more. See that AMPA type of receptors are more and more, right? So that increasing, so in a way increasing the strength of the postsynaptic neuron because the receptor number is getting increased gradually. So now you can think the capacity of this postsynaptic neuron also increasing. So with the neurotransmitter, whatever release, they all can be used up and this neuron can fire its maximum rate. Initially there are few receptors, therefore the capacity of this postsynaptic neuron was not that great, not that great extent. But because of the slower activity for longer time, the specific interval whatever I'm mentioning, there is change in the postsynaptic neuron, there is an increasing density of the receptor type, specific receptor type, particularly the AMPAR receptor type. And because of the increasing density of the receptor type, these postsynaptic neurons are now getting more and more strength. Okay, and once, so that's called the post-LTP, and this is actually what happens. This is called, the terminology is called LTP, long-term potentiation. Because of the continuous activity of these two neurons, there is a generation of long-term potentiation in the postsynaptic neuron. This long-term potentiation, again, you can think about the EPSP. We know that EPSP is generated in the postsynaptic neuron, but this LTP is another form of EPSP. Okay, so depending on, so if you put a stimulus with a specific interval and the particular intensity of the stimulus is there, and that can lead to this kind of changes in the postsynaptic neuron, then only you can consider it's a long-term potentiation. I hope I am able to give some idea about it. Okay, so once this thing happens, once this postsynaptic neuron getting more and more strength, and if it still continue for more time, then you will be able to see formation of new dendritic spine in nearby area. It can be in presynaptic, even it can be in the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so that's how a new dendritic spine, or you can think new synapse, are actually generated. I'm just again going back and summarize it. So if this, just think about the presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron. In case of memory, learning and memory, there is a neurotransmitter, specific neurotransmitter, that's called the glutamate. So once the glutamate is released, once the neuron is active, glutamate is released, it will work in postsynaptic neuron. And there are different receptor types are there. Okay, once they bounce to the receptor, postsynaptic neuron get activated. But if this event is persistent for longer time, just think you are reading books, same thing with a particular gap. 1 hour intervals, you are reading the same thing again and again. Or you are, in other way, you are stimulating these two neurons with a particular interval again and again. Then you are able to see some changes in the postsynaptic neuron. The density of the postsynaptic receptor of the postsynaptic neurons are actually increasing. In other way, the activity, I mean, strength of the postsynaptic neurons actually increased. Now, once this continues for a long time, then there is a generation of new synapse or new dendritic spines. I hope. So that's how you can store the memory of that particular incident. I hope it's clear to you guys. So this is how the summary is, and this is some of the things that probably is difficult to explain, but even many things we don't know about this point. So I'm just summarizing some of the point. Like memories are encoded in the form of a new synapse and circuit. I think that's no doubt for you guys to understand. Any new memory when you get or when you form in your brain, there must be a formation of new synapse and must be formation of new circuit. And that circuit has to be stable enough. If it is not stable for a long time, say suppose now at this moment you are making a lot of new synapse, you are making a lot of new circuit in your brain for this today's class, and next moment you go home and probably you forget. If you just absolutely forget everything, then you think about all those circuitry synapse that is formed, it's gone. It's not there anymore. But tomorrow, if you just remember some of the event, today's event class, then you can expect there are some synapse related to this event that exist, and some circuits that exist. So you can understand what is long-term memory and what is short-term memory. And maybe even after one day you might forget. So if you give again another rehearsal, just to repeat the same process, then probably this memory will be more and more strong. On the other hand, the synapse and the related circuit would be much more stronger, and they might be able to stay forever. There are many memory, your childhood memory sometimes are very, very strong, and they can persist for life. Okay, and this, of course, there will be new protein synthesized during the process. And there's another two interesting point, that circuit that involved in forming memory and the recalling memory. Initially, it is thought the same circuit, but in today's current scenario, if I say what is happening, is probably different. So still not clear whether it is the same or different. And the different memories are stored in different interconnected brain regions. We talked about only hippocampus, but I will show some example. But the different kinds of memory are stored in different brain regions. Depends on kind of memory what you can think. Here is some of the example. I think you will be excited to see that. So first thing is, think about, I was showing the 3D image of a hippocampus. See this? Why is named hippocampus? Now you can easily understand. Okay, there's two hippocampus structure in our brain. And if you just take a coronal section that I mentioned you how you cut, if you cut section this way, right, front to back side, if you look at the internal structure, it is like this. This is typical architecture of a hippocampus, and each and every part has a name. So this is the area where my pointer is called dentate gyrus, CA3, CA2, CA1. So don't remove all those, just to give you a sense, and this is extensively worked out. Okay, so now what example I am showing here is a man with no memory. So this is the subject, this is the person who was actually having a serious epileptic seizure, serious problem. So he used to show often seizures. You understand what a seizure means? So someone have epileptic fit. So then doctor actually, to correct that fit, correct that epileptic seizure, doctor did a surgery. So removed some part of his brain, and accidentally that part of the brain was the hippocampus. And it was amazing that all had been actually understood later. The doctor did a so precise surgery that resulted a complete and nice, a very nice way to remove the whole, like this entire hippocampus, two part of these two hippocampus. So you can understand how surgery has to be so precise. So at the end of the surgery, the person was perfectly okay. He was corrected. That's his problem. Like epileptic seizures was completely cured. But then the problem that he landed up is he's not able to make any new memories. That's what was the problem. And that gave you the hint, that gave you clear understanding that this area of our brain is responsible for memory, storing memory. Okay, and this guy was the subject for intense research. He was survived. Now he dead. He has survived for a long time, and there are many research actually conducted on this guy, and gave a lot of new information. A lot of information came from the study of this guy. So he is very, very in the neuroscience, even in psychology, he is commonly known as HM. Okay, in psychology book or in neuroscience book, whenever you hear about HM, nothing but Henry Molaison, is a man with no memory. So this is how you can understand. So this actually gives you a sense how from this kind of incident you can understand how a specific part of our brain is involved in specific work, specific task. Okay, so here hippocampus is involved in storing memory. And I'm just kind of diluting the things. This is just to excite some of you. If some of you electrical engineering students are there, this I'm just mentioning one of the famous neuroscientists in Indian origin. So he's now in MIT. And the most interesting thing is he is a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Kanpur. So that's what I'm saying is just to motivate some of you. And if one person can be excited to think about this, the exciting field of brain science, you can have a huge potential in your future. Yes, just to give, even just to give you another example, the current at this moment, the Prime Minister's principal scientific advisor, K. Vijayaraghavan, is also a neuroscientist. Okay, he was director of National Center for Biological Science in IT and in TIFR. So that tells you the future prospect, okay, of neuroscience. Anyway, let's come back to subject. I'm almost going to, no, some parts are left. So this is another neurotransmitter system. It's called GABA, and you know this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. If you look at the transmission aspect, pretty same. So only thing is, once this presynaptic neuron get excited, it release the chemicals, okay, and that chemicals is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. Once they will bound to this neuron, it will cause hyperpolarization. So you remember that the entry of chloride ion, more and more negative charge, and thereby this neuron can be inhibited. And just to give you, if somebody was asking some questions, just to think about, so this kind of inhibited neurons are present only those places where you need to shut down or you need to control the activity of an activated an excitatory neuron. So in other way, you can think about it. This is excitatory neuron, okay, and it is activated by some other ways, and maybe too much of activated, then this neuron will come and release inhibitory neurotransmitter and can slow down the activity of this neuron. And that's how it actually always happens. That's how we have a very controlled activity. Okay? That's how we make the balance. The problem is, I forgot to mention, but if you release too much of inhibitory neurotransmitter in certain circumstances, or if you find out some of the agent that can mimic the activity of this receptor, inhibitory neurotransmitter receptor, then you probably able to completely shut down the activity of this neuron. Neuron may not be able to at all fire. Okay. So in that case, you can think, what are the situation you can think about it. Suppose you want to anesthetize. You want to do a surgery, long time surgery, and you want to anesthetize, or you want to doing on surgery. So in those circumstances, sometimes people use an agonist of different kind of this inhibitory neurotransmitter receptor. Okay, so therefore you can it can be, I mean, sometimes it can be senseless because too much of inhibitory transmission is going on, but it will be reversible. After sometimes things can be fine. Okay, so this is our GABA circuitry, and this is another interesting aspect. This is called reward circuitry in our brain. So how I should start, and this is interesting in other ways. So just think about, many times, if you look at the red marks here, people use drugs of abuse drugs. And some of the abuse drugs mentioned here: cocaine, amphetamine, heroin, LSD, lysergic acid, or cannabis. Cannabis, I think, is most commonly used in local areas. Okay, so why I'm trying to tell you that once people use those kind of abuse drug, what kind of feelings, what kind of experience they actually get from this. If any of you have experienced that, you will know that. But I am sure, I am expecting most of you don't know about it. So what the feelings they get once people use cocaine or once people use cannabis? So they get some kind of, why they repeatedly use it, first thing. There must be experience some good thing. So once people take this kind of abuse drug, it actually leads to some of the exciting things. And one of the important things I think in terminology is called euphoria. Probably next slide I'll talk about it. Euphoria, which means intense happiness. So that tells you why people use it. So people, if you want to get happy, you want to get energetic, you want to get very, very happy. That's the purpose people use these drugs. But once you use for a long time, you become dependent on the drug. So that's a different aspect. So now the question comes here, how that happened? For you to ask the question.
Sir, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, but your voice is very low.
I'm taking an exit and again going in. What is fine?
So still the voice is very low.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Now it's better, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me present my slide. Okay, so I hope you are able to see my slide. So what I was trying to tell you that our brain has a reward circuitry. Okay, I was giving example how abuse drugs stimulates our reward pathways. Okay, so the question I was asking is why our brain is evolved with such a reward circuitry. Okay, is that we should be having pleasure, happiness? That's the reason. So now think it why. Okay, so now we see some of the natural circumstances. I'll just give you an example. The day you first hear that you cracked the IIT exam, JEE advanced exam, and think about your feelings at that moment. That can give you an idea. I mean, that is the time your reward circuitry in your brain, and reward circuitry in your brain is actually extensively activated, and that's the example you can think for intense happiness. And in other words, you can think people who use those abuse drug like cannabis can have pretty similar kind of feelings, and that's the reason why they goes for repeated use. I hope you understand. So that's the reward circuitry in our brain. I am not going details about that. The different parts of our brain are involved together to make that reward circuitry. But most important thing that you must remember is the neurotransmitter that plays important role in our reward circuitry is called dopamine. Okay. There are a lot of elegant experiments people have done to dissect out this reward pathway in animal. There are animal, I mean, if you study neuroscience any textbook, you will find out if you stimulate, if you put an electrode in a specific area, like in these areas, like nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, if you put a fine electrode in these areas and excite, and if you excite this area, you will be able to see, or you will be able to see that that animal can repeatedly go for a particular task, like drinking some water or drinking specific things, it's liquids. So the experimentally can prove that there are hubs, there are places which plays important role in reward pathways. Anyway, but think about these drugs which also does the same thing. Yes, who is this? So now, can you hear me now? So anyway, so now, have you seen? Are you able to see my next slide? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this
Yes,
is
sir.
about cannabis, euphoria, and pain relief. So I was just continuing about the study about your reward pathways. So this cannabis is also activates your reward pathways, and how it can do it? So it does by activating a specific receptor that's called, again, that's a G protein coupled receptor. This cannabinoid receptor that are highly concentrated in the different parts of your, you see about your circuitry. Okay, so when somebody takes cannabis, it binds to a specific receptor that's called cannabinoid receptor that is present in these regions, and thereby can activate this circuitry. At the end, dopamine will be released in this circuitry, which will be ultimately playing the role. Okay, so that's how area circuitry is activated by cannabis. Okay, and euphoria, I mentioned, euphoria means the intense pleasure or happiness. That's what you can experience once somebody take cannabis. But I gave you a natural consequence. I gave a good example, I guess. The day you got first, you came to know, the moment you came to know that you got this rank in your JEE Advance. The think about the moment, that moment your feelings. That's typically you can think about euphoria. And that's what the thing people experience when they take drugs of abuse. So that's the reasons they try to repeatedly use and use, without knowing the consequence, what could be happening after prolonged use. So it's a matlab nahi that you will be using these things. This is a dangerous. I mean, you have to think about the use of cannabis or whatever the drugs of abuse I mentioned here. They are dangerous because you will be completely dependent on those after some use. After sometimes once you use for some times, you'll be dependent on that, and at some point you will reach a stage when your brain is no longer able to tolerate. So you have to understand, when you are taking this kind of drug repeatedly, there is constantly some changes going on in your brain. By now you understand that, because this agent is changing some neuronal circuitry in your brain. Of course, they are activating this reward circuitry, but prolonged use can cause a lot of changes in these pathways. Okay, and once you try to remove it, once you try to quit this, you will not able to do it, because by the time your brain has already changed, you are no more whatever you are. A lot of changes happens in your brain. So therefore, to control that, you need completely different things. Sometimes people use some kind of antagonist to treat that drug addicted person. So I'm not talking details about that, but at least you understand how the drugs of abuse, and also sometimes ourselves in natural circumstances, use this reward circuitry to activate and get the different kind of happiness and pleasure. Okay, so in case of cannabinoids, in case of cannabis, we of course use exogenous cannabis, but pretty similar molecules also released in our body. When you are feeling happy, or when you are feeling, maybe when you do exercise, as I mentioned here, So these kind of molecules, pretty similar kind of molecules that like behaves like cannabis, it's called anandamides. These kind of molecules are actually released from our body and thereby can produce this kind of effect. When you eat when you get high fever, most times you use a medicine called paracetamol, right? And I'm sure all of you use. And probably what is more interesting for you guys to know that this paracetamol also activates cannabinoid receptor and thereby helps to relieve pain. When you take paracetamol, you are out of the pain, right? Your pain is relieved. So one of the reasons it relieves pain is it binds with cannabinoid receptor and by there we can activate those receptor. Okay. So this is what it is. So I just have two more slides. So just a continuation of my earlier study when I talked about the plasticity. I'll just continue with one or two slides. So by now you know what is brain plasticity. I explained you. So again I'm repeating you. The plasticity of our brain can be defined like the change or ability of our brain to change and adapt in response to environmental cues, experience, training, and so on. And because of the change, because of the continuous change of our dendritic spines that is present in the neurons, our brain is plastic. I hope there is no doubt about it. Our brain is plastic because the hardware component that present, if I tells you this way, hardware component that present inside the neuron are continuously changing in response to stimulus. So stimulus can be different kind of environmental stimulus, it can be experience, it can be training, and so on. So that's the plasticity. So our brain has enormous amount of plasticity. It can change like anything, whatever way you want to change, probably it can change. Okay. So now I hope that's no problem to understand for anybody. So what I'm trying to give a picture, so that's called plasticity. So now I'll just give you some sense about, just think about the day you born, and here is the neuron number, and have a little branching. Just think about the 6 years of old, when probably you are first maybe going to class 1, I'm just guessing, class 1. And just think about your teenage, 14, 15 years of age. Or just think about your age now, you're just probably 18, 19, 20, right? Age. Now look at the structure of the neurons. You see there is 6 years of age, there is more and more connections, more jungles, and that may be a little bit reduced, but it's still denser than the birth you are. So what it tells you, the number of neurons. Are you able to hear me? There's some sound is coming. Are you able to hear me? Some problem is happening. Is it okay for you guys? Yes. Okay, so what I'm trying. Okay, so what I'm trying to explain you, if you compare different age, like the day you born, you're 6 years old, they all you have passed, and your teenage. The number of neurons that present is nearly equal. But what is the difference that you can see is the extensive branching. You look at the extensive branching in 6 years of age and also 14 years of age, but it's reduced a little bit. So the more and more branching means more and more connection. More and more connection is happening because more and more dendritic spines. You just go down gradually, and so more and more synapse. So now if you plot this, now if you just roughly plot this synapse number, just can think like this. This is the frontal part and the back side of our brain. You just look at your visual cortex. So the number of connections is stood up and then is going down. Is there any problem for you? Anybody? Who is doing this? So now it's fine. So you see, if you plot the number of connections or number of synapses, so you see there is sudden increase of the number of synapses just after your birth up to certain age. And that varies from part of your brain to part of your brain. And if you look at the visual cortex, by
Sir, you are muted.
Are you able to hear me? Yes, now I think fine.
Yes, sir.
Who is doing this? There are people constantly doing nonsense. Anyway, if anybody want to understand, I hope this is fine. So what I'm trying to make clear is the synapse number is so continuously changing in our brain, and the change is more dramatic when you are in childhood. Another way you can think, our childhood brain was more plastic than the adult. The teenage probably is the turning point. So if you think in yourself, when you are in child, say about 6 years of age, 7 years of age, that time your brain was extremely plastic than the age that you are now. Of course, your plasticity in your brain is exist. It will end. It will continue till your death. But it was extremely plastic when you are in childhood. So that this peak tells you. So you can understand every part of your brain has a specific peak. I hope that part is clear. So what's the significance of it? The significance of it, I can give you one example. If you want to learn any new language at this age, it is going to be very hard for you. But it could have easily you can learn in this years when you are in class 1, class 2, class 3. That gives you clearly what's the advantage of plasticity in the brain, at least early plasticity in the brain. I think that's clear. And this peak in neuroscience is often considered is the critical period peak. So different part of your brain has a different critical period. So how can you define critical period? Because of the rapid formation and rapid elimination. That's the peak is considered is the critical period, and you all have crossed that stage. Okay, the early stage of your childhood is the most sensitive period in your brain. Okay, so I think, and that happens because you know now that the synapse that is present in your brain are constantly forming and eliminating, and that makes your brain plastic. I think that's enough, and you can understand what's the importance of this plasticity. So I think that's enough. I think you can ask me as many as questions. I think 5 minutes or 10 minutes you can ask. You can ask as many as time, as long as you can want. But there are some problem happens in between. So maybe I'm not able to explain some of the things. Not go, but I'll just show you 1 minute, one video clip if you are able to see it. Just see it.
So there is no audio.
No sound? You're not getting any sound?
No, sir.
Okay, I'll put this in your share folder, the folder. You can see that. So then I can close it. So I'll put this in the folder so you can see that. So now if you have any questions, can ask me. If you guys have any questions, I hope now I'm audible. Yes. Anybody have any questions, or otherwise I'll query it. Any questions? Okay, no. Okay, fine. Then I am leaving. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. No questions.
Okay, no question. Okay, fine.